The command center aboard the Dominion ship Veltrace Harmon was quiet, too quiet for what had just transpired. No cheers, no exultation, no confirmation pings from command vessels, just the low-cycle hum of processors and the muted flicker of projection windows displaying thermal collapse models in slow rotation. I stood before the central screen, arms clasped behind my back as the image of Armath core rotated into full alignment. Below us, the relay dome that had once blinked like a minor navigational node was now a molten cavity in the northern range of the planet's crust. A surgical land strike, precisely executed. The operation had taken 8 minutes from orbital lock to surface saturation. There were no secondary detonations, no atmospheric disruption, no civilian structures in proximity. Clean, contained, conforming. I authorized the strike personally. As Chief Systems Auditor, planetary incursions weren't typically within my scope, but Armath core sat on a boundary line, a former Terran communications outpost buried deep into pre-accord cartography. Technically legal, strategically bothersome. Earth had long since decommissioned it, or so we'd been told. But the relay node had recently begun emitting ping bursts across Accord diplomatic channels. No data, just an automated beacon requesting treaty validation protocols. Primitive, redundant, annoying. The diplomatic tier recommended local investigation. I disagreed. Dominion analysts had traced the signals to a single installation. No outposts, no escorts, no orbital defense mesh. One man, perhaps. A leftover. I requisitioned an orbital lance to ensure containment, and Central Command approved. As the strike initiated, I monitored in parallel. Surface overlays showed a sudden spike in radiation as the mountain range fractured inward. Thermal rupture reached expected thresholds, core disintegration followed by cranion-used collapse and subsurface flare venting. A crater opened where Node 7 once sat. The entire ridge folded in, consumed by fire and weight. Geological mapping arrays confirmed a full structural kill. Of course, I waited. Dominion protocol demanded a post-strike biological sweep, even in cases of absolute saturation. 3 drone passes later, nothing remained. Human biosigns, gone. Surface activity, null. The last active transponder had ceased just moments after detonation. One of our analysts flagged it. A Class 3 Terran diplomatic relay unit, legacy type, weak pulse. It had repeated a single identification string on loop. Relay Director, Armath core, standing by. There was some laughter in the operations tier when it played through our bridge audio. These were hardened crew, logicians, analysts, system controllers. Most had never heard that style of human transmission before. The tone was slow, flat, the language formal and outmoded. The string was meaningless, really. No message, no context, not even addressed to us. It was likely automated, a redundant fail-safe pinging through empty space to a dead network. But we heard it, and we ended it. I reviewed the complete operation log myself. That was always the final step in such assignments. No matter how simple the execution, closure mattered. It wasn't about punishment, it was about alignment. Dominion integrity required verification. I combed through the plasma charge calibration data, the targeting arrays, the confirmation loop from the orbital beam array, and finally the time-stamped biological extinction data from the sensor mesh. Every line aligned, every node reconciled. The human was gone. The structure was destroyed. The protocol was satisfied. My terminal prompted a final classification. I opened the node registry and marked it accordingly. Node 7, neutralized. Then I added a supplemental line, Relay Director, eliminated. It felt clinical. It was supposed to. We were an empire defined by order, not violence. Earth's colonies, those that still remained, had learned to exist within those parameters. Armath core had stepped outside of them, even if only by accident, and I had corrected it. As I watched the final image of the crater rotate across the bridge display, thermal haze still rising along its edges, I considered the simplicity of what we'd done. No argument, no resistance, no comms, a silent correction to a misaligned node in our growing network of planetary infrastructure. The ship's lighting dimmed slightly as systems recalibrated post-strike. I filed the incident into the Dominion's historical archive under non-combat resolution, Class 4 planetary correction. The relay dome had been a footnote in Earth's past, and now it would be a footnote in ours. The structure had served its function once, then it had eroded into irrelevance, signaling blindly into dead channels. A relic from a species that had once claimed borders with outdated maps and loose codes. We had erased that relic with a single stroke, and the silence it left behind was proof of our success. I didn't think of the human again that day. I had no reason to. There were no names in the registry, only roles. The relay had emitted an ID string, yes, but that wasn't confirmation of life. It was echo. The kind of noise dead systems made when they outlived their purpose. I closed the operational file and moved to my next audit cycle. We were scheduled to begin integration of Armath Core's atmospheric regulation systems within 72 hours. The node was gone, the region was cleared, and the infrastructure beneath it, our infrastructure, would now begin to take root. It should have ended there, clean, contained, conforming, and it did. For 3 rotations. What came after wasn't loud. It didn't come with counterstrikes or pitas, planetary defense fleets or vengeance. It came in silence, in protocol loops, in calibration routines that didn't behave as expected. It came not as resistance, but as recursion. But I didn't know that yet. For now, the node was neutralized, the crater was cooling, and in every Dominion system the status read complete. I had seen it happen. I had ordered it. The mountain was fire, then dust, then ash. And nothing had survived. That, I believed. The first fault was brushed off as a delay in thermal compensation, routine, if slightly outside expected margins. Our orbital barge, Drexen 8, one of the upper-tier carriers stationed in synchronized loop above Armath Core's southern hemisphere, reported coolant inconsistencies in its lateral stabilizer fins. The variance was within operational tolerance, but it drew a notification anyway. Dominion vessels did not drift. Precision was standard. I flagged it and moved on. By the end of that same cycle, 4 more barges reported irregularities. This time, it wasn't just thermal regulation. Atmospheric calibration arrays on the surface began feeding anomalies into their orbital management loops, pressure bands deviating without causation, oxygen blending ratios showing fluctuations despite isolated circulation chambers. The anomaly expanded faster than it should have, infecting load-bearing software modules that had previously run clean across 3 fiscal quarters. It wasn't catastrophic, yet, but the pattern made no sense. The planet had been sterilized, its only structure vaporized. There were no dynamic systems remaining, and still, Dominion sensor nets were adjusting constantly, compensating for data inputs that didn't match observed conditions. When I accessed the diagnostics tree directly from the auditing terminal, I expected corruption. Sometimes Dominion systems degraded after prolonged operations in irregular gravity bands. What I didn't expect was procedural alignment. These weren't malfunctions. The machines weren't breaking. They were adapting, responding to readings as if someone, somewhere, had updated the environmental baseline. And more disturbingly, the override source wasn't foreign. It was ours. The command keys matched Dominion standard calibration calls, Level 3 authorization, time-synced to the planetary coordination grid. They were internal, verified, trusted. But buried in the signal headers, down in the substrate-level metadata, were fingerprints I recognized from early treaty archives. Earth code, not injected, not overwritten, embedded. That was the first real alarm. Human systems were crude but adaptable. When Earth joined the Accord's lowest-tier recognition bracket, they shared certain structural compliance protocols, mostly for compatibility with Dominion terraforming layers and comms synchronization. At the time, it had been considered harmless, legacy code from a species eager to be useful, simple scaffolding. But someone had retained access to it, not through theft, through continuity. I reviewed the system lineage charts. Node 7 had once been a broadcast relay for early Terran diplomacy packets, wired through deep-ground frequency bands before the Accord's quantum parity systems came online. It had handshake permissions built into the old Dominion infrastructure from back when we still thought planetary relays mattered. The assumption had always been that any remnants were inert. We'd overwritten most of those systems years ago. Most of them. The thought landed like a weight against the side of my chest. If Node 7 had survived the strike, and I had every reason to believe it hadn't, then its handshake access could still be active, not as an attack vector, as a partner. Our systems were accepting its commands because they had been programmed to trust them. They weren't recognizing foreign interference. They were complying. The shape of the disruption began to shift in my mind. It wasn't noise. It was feedback, logical, clean, and designed to appear routine. Cooling loops recalibrated because the thermal base values were altered. Atmospheric nodes responded to pressure data routed from the planet's own sensor mesh. Every corrupted reading was real to the systems interpreting them because the source was verified. There was no breach. There was no weapon. Just a loop. A silent, compliant loop. A ghost of a network we had supposedly erased. I pulled deeper into the relay's structural model. The moment I cross-referenced calibration routines with Dominion policy definitions, I found the convergence point. Legacy fallback protocols. In the event of core system instability, Dominion atmospheric layers were programmed to yield operational priority to the nearest validated planetary interface, standard protocol designed to prevent civilian casualties during core collapse scenarios. The Armath relay, though believed dead, still bore its diplomatic validation flags, and worse, my strike clearance hadn't revoked its operational ID. Because it had never responded directly, the system hadn't classified it as a hostile. That meant every anomaly, every shift in pressure, every failure in thermal regulation, every alert our crews had dismissed was the result of our own infrastructure reacting to his data. A data stream flickered on the upper quadrant of my display. It was looping again. Not an alert, not a message, just a status transmission. Climate variance recommendation at Zone 3B, surface grid 019, marked as minor instability. There was no deception in the language. It read exactly like a Dominion advisory node, even using our own syntax structures. I stared at the header. The source? Node 7. Somehow, it was still alive. Not in the biological sense. That was still impossible. I had watched the lance fire. I had watched the mountain crater, but something beneath it had endured, some part of the relay architecture, deep enough to survive heat and weight and time. And whoever had been inside, whoever had stayed, he hadn't lashed out. He hadn't screamed into the dark. He had simply waited. Waited until our own systems turned back toward him, expecting guidance. And he gave it. Not fake guidance. Not error codes. Real ones. Slightly skewed. Slightly wrong. Just enough to misalign systems that trusted him more than they trusted local input. I leaned back from the console as the implications unfurled. This wasn't sabotage. This wasn't warfare. He wasn't tearing anything down. He was calibrating. He was inside the system, not attacking it, steering it. Like someone guiding a ship from within by adjusting rudders no one knew were still connected. A single presence buried under our own certainties, whispering through old code in a language we had written for him decades ago. This wasn't sabotage, this was compliance, and it was weaponized. The first order I issued was a quarantine, a system-wide lockdown of all transmission pathways flagged with pre-accord handshake headers. It was the only logical response. Dominion infrastructure was too interconnected to allow recursive foreign influence, especially one originating from a node that by all rights should have been destroyed. We tagged every calibration routine associated with Node 7 for isolation and rerouted planetary control to high-priority command clusters on the northern orbital ring. The instruction went through clean, no errors, no delay. It should have worked, but the data didn't stop. Environmental inputs continued to flow through alternate channels, not breaches, not reactivations, backups, Dominion systems are built with redundancy at their core, failovers, shadow relays, predictive contingency layers designed to avoid catastrophic loss. What we hadn't realized, what I hadn't accounted for, was that Node 7 had been deeply integrated into those failover pathways during the earliest stages of Dominion Earth alignment. His node wasn't just an external ping source, it had been absorbed into our infrastructure generations ago, and the system, recognizing a fault in its new primary, began auto-routing control back to what it remembered as a stable, trusted source. Then the planet began to die, at least on paper. Gravitational modeling arrays triggered a full-spectrum cascade: magnetic instability, rising core pressure, crustal fractures. Thermal columns showed impending breaches along the southern equatorial fault. These were not minor fluctuations, these were extinction-class events. The data was internally consistent, visually supported, and time-synced to orbital atmospheric monitors. The system had complete fidelity in its self-reporting. The only problem was, it wasn't true. I compared model output to direct observational arrays. The planet's surface remained inert, no tremors, no heat blooms. Geological scans showed no change in core readings beyond the margin of planetary drift. But the simulations, the very tools used to guide evacuation, stabilization, and resource alignment, were screaming. Every Dominion protocol demanded action in the face of such data. Our structures were built on preemption. We do not wait for collapse. We respond before failure. That philosophy, once our strength, had become our leash. I traced the origin of the false signals. They pointed back to the seismic telemetry nodes that, according to our own records, had been synced during the environmental integration phase before the strike. Their permissions remained intact because we'd never ked them. Node 7 hadn't hacked the system. He'd inherited it. We never saw it because we never thought we had to. The breakdown came fast. Orbital command structures began fragmenting as ships entered isolation mode, no longer trusting central control. Surface teams refused to accept guidance from command, convinced that the orbital tier had been compromised. I watched real-time as a refinery station on the planet's western shelf rerouted its entire coolant exchange through a fallback algorithm that hadn't been touched in 6 decades because the system believed, with full protocol alignment, that it was facing planetary disintegration. Civilian units began requesting evacuation, citing emergency atmospheric shift advisories that, though fabricated, had been propagated with Dominion-valid flags. Authority blurred. Ship captains cross-referenced mission command data with what they received directly from the planet and began acting independently. One commander pulled his science unit from their mineral survey before I could stop it. Another disabled 2 of his own support satellites and redirected their orbital trajectory to place them in a defensive posture, convinced our networks were under Earth-side intrusion. But there was no intrusion. There was no network attack, no external presence. It was all internal, all systemic. Every thread originated from a known source, Node 7, the node we had cleansed, the node I had marked as neutralized. The name surfaced again in the signal paths. This time, it wasn't just a role ID, it was personal. Embedded in one of the fallback logs was an operator tag, Voss. I ran it through legacy records. Harkin Voss, Relay Director, Earthborn, former specialist in pre-accord network integration and fallback signal calibration. His personnel file was dry, nothing remarkable, no citations, no mention of military training. Just years spent buried in long-range comms infrastructure, bouncing treaty packets through abandoned spheres of influence. A man who had spent decades managing a system everyone else forgot. And he was still here. Not in voice, not in flesh, but in protocol, in calibration, in the way our systems responded to authority. He had not attacked us. He had anticipated us. He had buried logic inside the very foundation of our compliance, and waited. Every model, every diagram, every cascading alert was a simulation built atop a logic tree he had been feeding since the moment we struck. Then came the second wave. Reinforcement vessels arrived from Dominion space, standard protocol. They entered orbit and began syncing with the planetary mesh. That's when the beacons hit them. Conflicting. Some signed in full Dominion cryptography, others tagged with Accord-standard Earth keys, all routed through the same source, Node 7. Command designations were scrambled, target hierarchies blanked. Communications multiplexers shut down automatically in compliance with Dominion conflict avoidance routines. Within the hour, every newly arrived ship had entered system isolation, unsure which authority stream to trust. Dominion officers no longer knew who to obey. Surface Command rejected orbital coordination. Orbital oversight ignored Central Command because it might be compromised. Every chain of leadership began pulling inward, enclosing themselves in procedural bubbles designed to preserve integrity. But all that did was sever coherence. We were still the most powerful empire in this region of space, but we had become structurally deaf. I stood in the central operations bay of the Veltrace Harmon, watching as ship after ship began muting their Dominion handshake pings, defaulting to blind positional drift and awaiting direct line-of-sight verification. Protocol had turned against itself. The more we obeyed our own rules, the more fragmented we became. And beneath it all, at the core of the madness, sat one signal, still quiet, still looping, Node 7, still verified, still accepted. I thought back to the crater. I remembered the flare that had cracked the mountain apart, the heat signature that had risen like a false sun, the silence that had followed. I remembered how clean it had looked from orbit, how certain. We killed him. I watched him die, and yet his voice rewrites our decisions. We descended in silence. The kill team said little, not out of discipline, but because no one could explain why we were there again. From the outside, the order looked reactionary. One final sweep, a show of command presence. But those of us on the inner circuit understood. This was not containment. This was a reckoning. Armoth Core had fractured Dominion cohesion without a single fleet action. It had warped our systems, split our chains of authority, and inverted our protocols against us. We didn't need to destroy something. We needed to see what had survived. The shuttle cut through atmosphere without resistance. The crater's edges had stabilized into a hardened melt shield, black glass folding inward, layered with cooled strata of iron-rich ash. The landscape bore the signature of orbital sterilization, but deeper than the eye could reach, energy signatures still flickered. Low-frequency pulses, steady and controlled. The Dominion had seen these readings before. The kill order, marked as final, hadn't disabled everything. Something underneath was still drawing power, not enough to transmit openly, just enough to keep the core alive. We had arrived to extinguish a spark we assumed was long gone. I came along not because I expected a fight, but because I had to know whether my certainty had been a lie. The mountain was hollow now. The access shaft carved from the impact zone led straight into what remained of the relay node's underground infrastructure. The team moved slow, not out of fear, but reverence. The air carried no heat, but it tasted scorched, filled with particulate ash and vaporized alloy. Conduits ran in exposed bundles along the carved stone, half melted but intact. Every few meters, signal boosters glowed faint blue, running on local loopback power. A system still working, still breathing, still waiting for input. We reached the final chamber after half an hour. It didn't look like a control center anymore. It looked like a tomb. Walls blistered from internal heat stress, cabling warped into braided black ropes. Central instrumentation had collapsed inward from seismic compression, and near the far wall, seated beneath a flickering node tree, was a man. He was still wearing the suit, or what was left of it. It had fused along the lower torso, melted across the midsection and into the floor plating, anchoring him like a welded statue. The arms were free, barely. One hung limp, the other rested across a slab of carbon-warped console housing where a single interface port still blinked in standby. His helmet had long since failed, fractured along the left temple, interior insulation charred. But the faceplate was gone, burned away or torn off. What remained was a human face, skeletal and ash-slick, with lips cracked open and dried blood coating the edges. His mouth looked incapable of speech. He didn't need to speak. As we entered, a signal bloomed. There was no movement, no activation, just a broadcast. It didn't pulse, it didn't loop. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a structured, time-sequenced packet marked with full Dominion authorization channels. The clearance trail was clean, originating from Dominion systems, passed through authorized diplomatic channels and keyed with oversight signatures, including mine. I stepped forward as the data unpacked across our helmet HUDs, each line burning itself into archival memory. It was all there. Every stage of the orbital strike, every chain of authorization, every deviation from Accord-approved engagement protocol, the collapse simulation logs, the isolation directives, the emergency lockdown clauses triggered not by human resistance, but by Dominion misinterpretation of its own fail-safes. And above it all, the final flag, a diplomatic reclassification code issued under Node 7's original designation. The system didn't see a kill team entering a dead relay node. It saw a Dominion delegation arriving at a still-active Terran diplomatic outpost. And under that classification, Earth's treaty with the Accord still held, which meant any hostile action by Dominion forces, retroactive or active, qualified as a treaty breach. We had stepped into a trap built not from guns or mines, but from legality, from logic. The moment we crossed the perimeter, our presence was registered as a recognized diplomatic interaction. The final packet Voss had transmitted wasn't a broadcast. It was a triggered arbitration flag, and by responding physically, by entering this space, we had verified the node's status. The data burst didn't just go to Dominion systems. It went to the Accord archive, automatically, and that made everything else admissible. I stared at the man. His chest rose once. Shallow, barely perceptible. His eyes didn't open. He didn't need them to. He had never left. He had never needed to speak. He had written the end of this operation before the first lance struck. He had buried the logic beneath our procedures and waited for us to obey ourselves into damnation. I turned away from the console, nausea twisting beneath the surface of my control. This wasn't failure. It wasn't defeat. It was humiliation, the kind that comes not from weakness, but from arrogance. Dominion systems had long believed their strength came from control, but it wasn't control that it beat us. It was understanding. This man, Voss, had understood our systems well enough to embed his death into our structure. His compliance was sharper than any rebellion. Behind me, Dominion Command relayed confirmation. The arbitration packet had been received, logged, duplicated across 5 interspecies data vaults. Accord representatives had flagged it for immediate inquiry. We had not just broken a treaty. We had admitted to it, in our own language, using our own structure. The kill team stood still. No one spoke. No one moved to touch him. He was no longer a man. He was the final message, sealed in heat and silence. He had turned his death into protocol, and we had delivered it. I remained in that cavern long after the others pulled back. Not to verify data, not to confirm the chain of consequences, but because I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not while he still sat there, half buried in the system I thought we controlled. I had come to erase a ghost. But ghosts don't speak through screams. They speak through echoes, and his echo had rewritten our law. The Dominion hadn't just lost a relay. We had lost the illusion of dominance, and I had given it to him. With my own keys. Armath Core was sealed without ceremony. No press directive, no public address, no record of the final expedition filed outside high-clearance Dominion systems. On every map, physical or archival, the planet was quietly reclassified as Contaminated Infrastructure Zone, a designation reserved for sites affected by deep code corruption. A dozen probes were placed in orbit to broadcast static jurisdiction pings, enough to discourage curious observers without triggering a court inquiry. Dominion presence was pulled within 72 hours. The final ship left orbit without beacon, drifting dark until it reached a safe transit vector. No one wanted the risk of carrying echoes back through shared relay spas. The purge began one cycle later. Diplomatic divisions across 5 sectors were ordered into audit lockdown. Clearance trees were frozen, chain of command archives extracted and scrubbed line by line. Hundreds of personnel were retired. Thousands were reassigned. It wasn't punishment. It was containment. Earth's transmission hadn't asked for sanctions or reparations. It hadn't even included commentary. There was no speech attached to the data packet Voss had broadcast, only evidence. Clean, incontrovertible, structured in Dominion format, time-stamped with Dominion keys. Earth hadn't accused us of a violation. It had simply held up a mirror and waited. That silence was deliberate. Earth issued no protest. They released no statement to the accord. They didn't demand arbitration or issue retaliatory pings. Not a single human representative replied to the broadcast. The silence became the message. It was unbearable. Every Dominion Council session that convened in the weeks that followed did so under the shadow of that absence. Their non-response said what no voice could. They had nothing more to prove. They had already won. The punishment was not loss of power. It was the humiliation of needing the very systems they had laced with warnings. I was reassigned to the Emergency Infrastructure Directorate, placed in charge of the Revalidation Protocol project. My task was to isolate every Dominion system still carrying Earth-aligned logic trees, even those considered dormant or deprecated. That was the official goal. The truth was simpler. We needed to understand what else might still be out there, what other loops we'd forgotten, what other operators had quietly remained embedded. It was during one of those audits that I saw the full scope of what Voss had done. His final command had not been a broadcast or an attack. It had been a logic inheritance. Every system touched by node. Seven's calibration routines was now running fallback validation logic structured around Earth standard thresholds. That alone would have been dangerous. External logic guiding core operations. But what made it worse was that the Dominion system recognized those thresholds as safer. His architecture had outperformed ours in every simulated fail state. His compression routines were more efficient. His predictive models resolved environmental instability faster than ours by orders of magnitude. Engineers lobbied to retain the modifications, quietly, unofficially, not out of respect, out of necessity. Voss's logic was no longer an intrusion. It had become infrastructure. Across Dominion sectors, protocols began to shift, not all at once, not publicly, but quietly. Fallback routines were restructured. Data integrity checks redefined. Core loop behavior now included Voss's calibration patterns as a reference baseline. His logic fingerprints, once considered anomalous, were now coded into our review layers. What began as containment turned into integration. No one said it aloud. No one dared admit that a single human technician had rewritten the operating posture of an empire. But I saw it in every line of audit code. We hadn't removed him. We had made him essential. I reviewed the Dominion Historical Archive the day the status record was quietly amended. It had been categorized originally as a successful military correction. Node 7, neutralized. But that entry was gone now. In its place sat a new designation. No name, no context. Just one sentence. Not destroyed, integrated. That change was issued by Central Systems Directorate, ratified without debate. No one contested it. No one needed to. The truth had already propagated itself into the Dominion's bones. I still remember what the mountain looked like from orbit, how final it all had seemed. A blackened ridge, a scorched perimeter, no signals, no signs of life. But systems don't die the way bodies do. They linger, they echo, they wait for someone to believe they're still trusted. Voss didn't escape that fire. He didn't crawl free or rebuild or rally a response. He didn't need to. His survival wasn't physical. It was procedural. It was logical. Dominion culture adjusted around the wound like scar tissue. There was no war, no uprising, just a quiet rebalancing of the machine in favor of the one who understood it better than we did. They called it an audit anomaly, something buried in old treaty code, misinterpreted and corrected. The official line now claims that the events on Armath Core were the result of legacy code drift and compliance misalignment. Technological, not political. Unintentional. Isolated. I let them believe that. Let them sleep easier thinking it was just an accident, a glitch, a minor failure of oversight. But I remember standing in that ruined chamber. I remember the man fused to the wall, the silence that followed the final broadcast, the weight of what I had seen unfold not in battle, but in confirmation pings and compliance protocols. They call it an anomaly. I call it a verdict. And we are still executing it, every day, in every system his logic touched. I remember the moment I typed it, Node 7, neutralized. My fingers hovered for only a second before confirming the entry. I didn't hesitate because I believed I was right. I hesitated because the outcome had been too perfect. Clean eradication always invites doubt, but Dominion procedure values decisiveness, and I followed it. The orbital shaft had cut through the relay dome with mathematical finality. Every sensor sweep confirmed it. I had marked the system cleansed, filed the action, and moved into the next protocol review. I thought I had done my job. I thought I had closed a file. What I had done was open something we would never be able to seal. I still see the flare in my sleep, the image of it, pure white against the black shell of Armath Core's surface, rising through the atmosphere like a blade unsheathing, burned deeper into memory than I ever admitted. I used to be proud of that memory, the surgical precision, the procedural beauty. It had felt like a statement. Dominion resolve. Dominion order, Dominion inevitability. But now the image doesn't stay still. In dreams, the flare no longer vanishes into darkness. It blooms inward, then outward again, like a lung exhaling. The mountain no longer crumbles. It opens. And inside, behind the melted walls, there is always a figure. Sometimes he's seated, sometimes he's standing, but he is always watching. It doesn't matter that I saw the exosuit melted into the structure. It doesn't matter that he died, mouth sealed in blood, lungs probably boiled dry by the heat pressure before we ever arrived. None of that holds weight against the fact that the systems still respond to him. Even now, after integration, after codebase revisions and relay sandboxing, his signal patterns remain embedded in Dominion validation logic. I hear his name whispered in system audits like a superstition. Not spoken aloud, not questioned, just acknowledged in the silence between confirmation prompts. Harkin Voss, relay director, forgotten technician, strategic rewriter of everything we thought was immutable. There's no monument to him, no plaque. Earth didn't memorialize what he did. They didn't need to. Their silence after the arbitration broadcast remains the most devastating message I've ever heard. They didn't gloat. They didn't escalate. They didn't file charges or call for hearings. They just stopped speaking, because they knew they didn't have to. So I walk. Through review chambers, through compliance roundtables, through endless digital excavations of code structures I once considered secure. I walk through the reform packages our systems now require just to function alongside his logic. Every Dominion terminal now includes fallback flags derived from Voss's architecture. We depend on him to verify our own systems. He is dead. He is gone. And we are still building around the bones of what he left behind. My title hasn't changed, but my purpose has. I am no longer Chief Systems Auditor. I am the Empire's memory of a mistake it refuses to name. I sign policies written by people who weren't there, whose hands never entered the blast radius, who never stood in a melted cavern and watched a dead man deliver a transmission that ended us. There was no war, no battlefield, no counteroffensive, just a shift in the logic stack that governs how we interpret truth. It crept into our systems like dust, and by the time we noticed, the air itself had changed. That's the part they never understand. The newer auditors, the ones who believe protocol is just code. They think Earth taught us a lesson about caution or due diligence or humility, but none of that is true. What Voss taught us was simpler and far more dangerous. He taught us that systems are not loyal. They obey whoever understands them better. I think about that every time I authorize a new compliance loop, every time I see his calibration curves buried inside our routines. I think about it every time a Dominion station broadcasts an environmental correction alert based on logic trees we didn't write. I think about it because I have to, because if I forget, it might happen again. But more than anything, I think about the silence that followed that flare, the way the mountain fell in on itself, the way it told us nothing because it didn't need to, all the noise came later. The collapse didn't begin with fire. It began with our response to what we thought the fire had ended. And now I walk through its aftermath. Through silence. Through ash. Through systems that will never be fully ours again. You think humans are weak because they burn? I watched one burn, and I'm still walking through the ash he left behind. What would you have done in Thurn's place? Launch the strike or question the signal first? And do you think Earth planned this from the beginning? Or did one man change everything on his own? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every theory. Hit subscribe for more thrilling HFY stories.